Hello and welcome to my second video on how to paint the Autarch Deathspinner. In the previous video I showed you how to paint it using a Wraithbone type finish, and after I'd finished painting it I looked at it and felt that it really didn't suit the style of the model. So here you can see I've completely painted over all of the Wraithbone painting in black. So I just used Vallejo model colour black, so it gives a nice kind of flat finish, not too satin. So it's a lot easier for me to see exactly what I'm painting rather than having any kind of shine reflection coming from, say, a black primer. What I'm going to be doing is a completely different style of finish. So the previous style was very textured, kind of a little bit matte, so that it wasn't high contrast and it didn't have strong shine points. In this one I'm having much smaller areas that are highlighted quite brightly, and then the rest is kept black, so that will be super high contrast and it should fit in much better with the blue shiny armour that I've got. You can kind of see already actually the little cylinder. I guess that's the ammunition thingy that plugs into it at the bottom. That's already been painted with the shine, so that's sort of the look that I'm going to try and achieve. The only thing is the cylinders are really easy to paint because you just paint like a straight line, following the shape of the cylinder. I'll highlight it up down the middle, pick out a few edges, add in a couple of lines here and there for additional reflections, and that's it, job done. The difference with the gun shape here is that it's got very awkward shapes. Some are a little bit flat and then curve at the edges, so you don't get the nice cylinder shape. There's hard edges all over the place, and just all sorts of random details jammed together. So the cylinder was the easy part to paint, and this is going to be trying to make the rest of the gun match it. If you look in the top left there, you can see I have quite a lot of grey colours. I've just mixed most of these myself. Now in the top right it's the Vallejo model colour black. Then in the top left it's Vallejo Basalt Grey. Those are the only two colours from the pot. All the greys below that are mixed with either black or white. So you can see the bottom right hand colour, that is Basalt Grey with some black added to it. Then the middle colour on the right, that's more black, so it's mostly black with just a little bit of Basalt Grey. On the left hand side it's exactly the same sort of thing with white added. So below the top left, on the middle, that's Basalt Grey with white, and then below that it's mostly white with a little bit of Basalt Grey in. And of course you can add further mixes if you want, just to make some of the blending a little bit easier, and take it up to white as well. I do end up taking it to white at the very end, just to really push the high contrast. If you look at the paint marks I've been making, I started off with I didn't use the darkest grey as the first highlight, so you can see that it's the one on the bottom right. So I could have done a darker highlight to start with, but it's not worth it because it's quite hard to see on the model. I mean, it is visible, but for the point of this is that I want to kind of map out the highlights fairly clearly. Now I can then highlight over the top of them with the brighter colours, but also I can blend this one in at the edges. So what that means is that there are fewer layers of paint where, so I just when I blend it in at the edges rather than starting off from the darkest one and adding extra layers. Because don't forget that I already painted the gun once with the Wraithbone effect, so all those extra layers kind of add up, even when you've done very thin layers, because there's an awful lot of layers on there now, and I don't want very heavy paint build up to kind of get an uneven kind of textured finish, or to obscure any of the detail as well. When you saw me paint, kind of like plot out a lot of the highlight points with the kind of the sort of medium grey colour, there's a lot of grey on the gun. Now as I go along, I'll be cutting back into that, because one of the dangers when you're painting something black and you're doing a lot of highlighting on it is that it will just end up looking grey all over rather than black. Now one of the ways I'm going to try and combat that, so I just mentioned I'm going to cut into the edges of some of the grey, or I'm going to, make less grey on there while still keeping the same highlight points, and also push the contrast, so it's going up to bright white for the highlights, but I want to get as much black in there as possible. That high contrast is really what's going to sell it as a black material. But it is a little bit tricky, especially with this, because there's a lot of detail on there, and I'm painting light volumes on it. Now, if I was just painting this purely with edge highlights, you get the same sort of concept, so you get very high contrast, but there's a lot more black on there. So you still take the edge highlights up to white or whatever, but with the large amount of black, you get a very high contrast, so it looks like a black gun. But again, you're not painting the light volumes on. So if you think all of those edge highlights plus light volumes and reflections, which means there's going to be grey painted onto a lot of the flat surfaces, then there's a lot of grey on the gun itself. So, as I said, there is always that kind of problem of trying to make sure that the gun doesn't look too grey. Whereas for other colours, it's not such a big deal because you don't know what the colour's supposed to be. You just see lights hitting it and things like that. But it's part of the problem with trying to paint light volumes on a small kind of scale model like this. A little bit easier on something like a bolt gun or whatever as well. They don't have quite as many like even sized details. If you look at this, it's just so many different details all over the weapon, but they're all of quite a large size, so they all need to be picked out with highlights and things. There's not a lot of area where you can just leave space to be black. The highlight placement is again my usual technique. Hold it under a lamp and see where the light hits it. And part of the problem with that, though, on again this small gun, and because I want it to be kind of shiny looking, is that when you hold this under the lamp, it all looks grey again. Like the light just pretty much covers the whole thing. Just some areas are lighter than others. And also I'm adding in the extra reflection, so you see under sort of what will be a soul stone that just underneath his hand there, in the middle of the gun. And there's little sort of reflections all over it. Reflections like that, they're just kind of like placed on there randomly. And with the light hitting the gun, as I said, it'll give you a good idea of where to do the primary highlight. And the primary highlight on this is like the main one that goes straight along the whole length of the gun. So you've got the whole body, and then the barrel bit. There's kind of like a line that goes all the way along it. That will be the primary highlight. That will be the brightest one. Most of the other highlights on there I've just made up. There's a lot of edge highlighting really going on this. And again, it's not my favourite to pick everything out in edge highlights, but on something like this, you just you kind of like run out of options in terms of being able to see the detail without just leaving it unpainted. But one of the things that you can do, and I will be doing it a little bit later on, is just take some of the black. So when you've got all your primary highlights on there, all your secondary highlights and things, get some black and water it down, turn it into a glaze, and then you have to prioritizing which highlights you want to be really visible and which ones you can afford to knock back a bit and kind of like just shade them down. But you do have to be careful. In photos, it might look like the highlights, you put too many highlights on there, but in the flesh, a lot of these, if you make the highlights too subtle, they just become almost invisible, because remember how small they are. And you just end up either seeing like the primary highlights and everything else looks like you haven't given it enough attention. And it is one of the compromises of balancing social media against in the flesh painting. You don't always get a good indication of what something looks like in the flesh when you see it online, partly because sometimes you get like really big clear photos so you can see all the detail very easily, but obviously you don't see that when you hold the model because it's a tiny little model. At the other time, people don't do great photos sometimes online, so it looks like everything's soft and blended together, whereas if it was a big clear photo, you would see that it's not all super neat and high detailed. So it's kind of like, but at the same time, it works better in the photo that way. So it's definitely a balance that you have to kind of achieve to do both. Like if you were just purely interested in competition painting and you didn't care about social media, then really looking at things online isn't the best way to judge how good that something's painted. You really need to see them in the hand. That's part of the reason why I'm a little bit unsure sometimes of online painting competitions, because you can paint a model purely to look good in a photograph, specifically to look good in a photograph, and it just won't look as good when you actually see it in the flesh. And again, but the alternate is true. You can paint something purely to look good in the flesh, but you take a photo of it and you just cannot, for love nor money, make it look good in the photograph. And that can sometimes be one of the issues when people see things like Golden Demon results. You see, all these winners and people like, that shouldn't have won. Why did that win? So and so's was better, and things like that. And it's usually a case in those situations that you have to see the models in the flesh to see what the judges were actually talking about for when they or why they've chosen certain things. Just getting back to what I'm doing here. So this is kind of like the biggest highlight on the weapon. That sort of the large kind of blocky looking one. Now I've over highlighted it here. I will be in a moment or two knocking it back again so that there's more black visible around it. All of these highlights, to achieve the sort of shiny look, they need to go from the highest highlight to black very quickly in the transitions, and that's another issue with the small scale of the weapon, because you just don't have a lot of space to get that blending in there. This weapon actually took me quite a long time to paint. Like, it already took me a long time to paint with doing the Wraithbone, which was kind of like a failed experiment. So then it also took me ages again after to repaint it with the black sort of shiny effect. What I'm talking about here, so you can see it clearly on the cylinder and also on the barrel section, just before the sort of like the red lightning filament stuff. If you see the highlights on those bits, again, those are curved, so they're much easier to paint these sort of highlights on. And also it's not like the primary highlight. It does line up, so if you see that line again that goes from the barrel all the way onto the body, all the way down to the handle at the end, there's a line. It's not quite straight because the weapon curves around a little bit, but you can follow that line. And this kind of like this area here, so I'm just painting in the black now. So I was talking about how it has to go from black to white really quickly in the transitions, and I've got quite a lot of grey in there. But I still need some transition there. You can't just paint it black and white, because it's too hard. There's no transition really, but it will just look like a white line painted on a black base. So you do need to use all the greys, but try and get as close as you can from going black to white while keeping those soft transitions down. Another thing for this as well is when cutting back into the colours, so you can see there I added more water to the black and the dark grey colour that I mixed. Remember, that was mostly black plus some basalt grey in it. But it doesn't have to be basalt grey, by the way. You can use any, you can just make all these colours up from black and white if you want as well. It doesn't really matter too much. But you do, when you're cutting into these colours and you're kind of like going over the transitions, you want your paints watered down quite a bit. So around about 2 parts water to 1 part paint, so it flows really nicely. It will make the paint slightly more translucent, but that's a good thing, because that will also help with the transitions at the edges of the highlights, because some of the lower layer will still go through. So it might be a case you have to do multiple layers of a colour if you want to make it a stronger black, or to wipe something out. But at the same time, if you go over that area once, some of the grey at the edge will still show through a little bit underneath, and that then helps with the transition. It's just another step in the transition from going from black to white. But it's a tricky balance to get right on something this small. But part of the nice thing about that is when you're painting in these first highlights, you really can be quite rough on how you place them, because you are going to be cutting out a lot of them. And actually, by being quick and rough with the highlight placement, you can get some random kind of, they're not really mistakes, but sort of like, what is it, the Bob Ross phrase, happy little accidents. And you can then turn those into interesting reflections on the weapon as well, or indeed any surface that you're painting. Just gone slightly out of focus here while I've turned the model around. It's just one of the issues where, as I move the model around, it can be a little bit tricky to keep everything in shot. But I think you can see what I'm doing anyway. So I'm just carrying on the primary highlight line, and you can see here how, again, that line that goes all the way along the gun, the highlight that I'm painting in, it sort of flares out at the end. And that's because if you look on the sculpting of the model, the model actually flares outwards. So you can see the little ring right next to that area. The ring on the model, the sculpted on detail, that obviously flares out even more, and the sculpting before that does line up with it. So what you'll find is when I've carried on at the very end and painted all these highlight lines all the way to the end of the gun, the lines will kind of all line up, but they flow over the detail. So it is kind of accurate to have the highlight sort of flare out. Now, I'm not painting the highlights on this as a mirror finish. Mirror finish works slightly differently. This is just like a shiny material. So you just get kind of like rough highlight shapes. Now, in reality, if you have a shiny surface, it entirely is dependent on the lights around it and the environment to where the highlights land. So realistically, not all the details on this weapon would catch the light, which is fine. If I was painting this as just something for a social media post, like, you can leave areas that are really dark black and things like that, and it will look great if you just pick a small area on the gun that catches a lot of light. It'll look natural, high contrast, and everybody will be like, wow, that looks great. But the problem is, I was going to paint this model for Chicago Golden Demon Adepticon. I got a little bit sidetracked. I've been painting a few too many different models, and I haven't got it done in time. But that's besides the point. The intention was to paint this as a Golden Demon piece. And I'm aware of when the judges look at a model, they'll be looking at it from every angle and make sure that you've applied the same amount of finish to all the areas on the model. So you can't just focus on doing a nice shiny highlight on one point and then leaving the rest virtually unpainted. Now you can do the thing where, and I mentioned this before, like in the sort of shadowy areas, you pay as much attention to them with the painting, but they just have to be darker. And that works, again, quite well on social media. It still sort of works in the flesh, but because this is such a small model, you try and paint in some of the subtleties like that, and they're very hard to see when you just hold the model in the flesh. It's only when you zoom in on camera that you can actually see these kind of things. So, I mean, it really depends. Also, the high contrast thing, so it's not super realistic having all of these high contrast details all over the weapon, but I think it still looks, reasonably good, just not super realistic. So some of these, like you can see me, I keep spinning the model around all over the place. It's a little bit tricky to film it. Ideally, I like to paint a model just upright all the time, so I can accurately plot out all the highlights and bounce highlights and shadows and everything like that. But because of like the shape of some of the weapon details, it's just hard. They get in the way of the the brush, and you can't do the best brush mark. Now I can sort of compromise to a certain extent, and I do on a lot of videos when I'm showing for you. I don't get the easiest brush direction marks for me when I'm doing it, because obviously if I was painting this purely with, for myself without a camera, I have the model very, very close to myself. Like my fingers would probably be a little bit closer to the edge of the right near the bristles for maximum control. Whereas as you can see, my fingers aren't in the shot there, and a fair amount of the ferrule is visible. So I'm compromising a little bit on control and things just so I can film this shot, because otherwise all you just see is the back of my head on this. But I think you can still get a good enough idea of what I'm doing. So every now and then when there's a little cut in between shots, I've just taken it away and neatened something up a little bit. But the general marks I'm making, they're all the same. It's just I can spend a bit more time on them and make sure they're just extra neat afterwards. So these little marks here that I'm making, this part of the gun at the back here, that's very flat. I say very, it's just flat. There's no curve on it. So this highlight that I'm painting in here, one, is too bright, and there's no technical reason for it. But what it does do is match the other highlights on the weapon. So I could just leave it black and then do an edge highlight around it, like a dull grey edge highlight going around, just to give it a little bit of definition. The problem is that it looks so different then to the rest of the gun. It will just stand out and look like it's unfinished. So here it's just like a little shine point. Now if you looked at these shine points and then you did try to and you had this gun in reality and you tried to get the same sort of shiny effect in this, it'd have to be like a very clean sort of empty environment, and then you've got a few spotlights pointing at the gun from different directions. Definitely not something you'd see on a battlefield in terms of the lighting situation. So probably atmospherically, it's not that the most battle worn, if you like, or not maybe not the most interesting even in terms of atmosphere, but I also think the sort of the style suits the Aeldari quite well. I wanted a more pristine kind of feel to the model, because I don't feel like especially an Autarch would be going around on the battlefield covered in dirt and grime or having scratches on his weapons or anything like that. They're supposed to be so elegant, kind of like elves, like Lord of the Rings elves and things. You never see them all covered in mud and grimy and things. They're always supposed to be super elegant and move very fluidly, and that's how I'm picturing the Aeldari. So I feel this sort of painting matches that quite well. I won't be painting like this all the time. I want to get back and do some other models. I've definitely got to paint some of the chaos that came with the Kill Team set, or maybe from the Eldritch Omens box. They're very similar to chaos models in both of them, but I'm going to paint at least one chaos model from one of those sets, and that will be a lot more rough and kind of mean looking, so I'll try and get some atmosphere into that, hopefully be a bit, or maybe not more interesting, but it will be different anyway. So part of the problem with this style of painting as well is it's a lot of very, very tiny movements, and it looks like you're not actually doing a lot when you do these paint marks, and that's part of the reason why this gun took me so long to paint. And again, that's not even taking into account the fact that it's a repaint, but every highlight you just have to spend ages trying to do these tiny little shine points, just to make them good and to a high standard, because I probably will still finish this off to enter into a competition, so I've got to get the high standard all around on it, and then we'll see how it does. This little highlight here, this one's being taken all the way up to white as well. So if you look, not all the highlights are taken up to white, just a few of them are. in kind of like, you know, various points on the gun, but those are sort of more prominent parts, and I've kept some of the areas, they're still highlighted but they're not taken up to pure white. You can see on the wet palette there in the top left, there's 2 little extra paints appeared on the left hand side. So one of them clearly is white. The one in the top left, that's model color black again. So all I've done is just dipped a bit of my brush in the black paint in the top right, plopped it over on the left there, and added a load of water so I could just turn that into a little glaze, and that was letting me knock back some of the the grey highlights that I felt were too strong. Now one of the main ones of those was the bounce highlight coming from underneath his forearm. So you remember, if you go back earlier in the video, there was a strong secondary line that I'd painted there with that sort of medium grey colour. And you can see quite clearly now that the middle of that, it almost looks black, but it's not. The line is still there. I just went over it quite a few times with a bit of watered down black to knock it right out. So it still follows the shape of the weapon, and you can actually do that with all of the lines if you want, really. You can, you know, put a bit of black glaze over it in the middle so it's very subtle still there, and it's still highlighted at either end. And that, again, not necessarily super realistic, but it will add more black to the weapon just to try and keep that sort of high contrast look going on. So there we are. That's the end of the video. For the photo here, it actually looks a bit more grey than you've just seen on the painting on the video. The video is a little bit more accurate than this photo. I put too much light on it. I didn't realise when I did the setup for the shot, but the light is sort of flooding the model here, and it's made so you can see all the black prime stuff. Even that looks quite light, whereas that's really fairly black because it's kind of satin as well. You pretty much just get the light reflections on there. So when you look at the gun, don't just think it's a bit too grey. It is black in reality. I've just taken a bad photo, but regardless, that's the end of this video. You can let me know which one you prefer, actually, the black gun or the Wraithbone. But I will be doing a Wraith Guard. Those are the little ones, I think. Yeah, I will be painting a Wraith Guard at some point with a whole Wraithbone technique. I may tweak it a little bit from the previous video just to make it a bit more interesting. But yeah, it's something to look forward to anyway. And also, I will be painting an avatar as well. I've got one of those from Games Workshop that I didn't manage to get done for the Warhammer community article, so that will show up shortly as well. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.